Heller was sold to Field Enterprises, but my visionary editor lost his job, and the contract was canceled. Heaven and Heller went into the drawer. A few years later, Rick Marshall recommended me to the Tribune Company as the writer of Dick Tracy, a job I held 15 years, starting in 1977. By the way, thanks, Rick. In the meantime, Chinatown happened, and a good but short-lived period private eye TV series called City of Angels, co-created by Stephen Cannell and Roy Huggins, appeared, as did those aforementioned novels by Bergman and Kaminsky. The private eye in period setting was becoming a distinct, if underutilized, subgenre of mystery fiction. But it still seemed to me that nobody had fully plumbed the potential of the PI in period. In fact, that was the problem. They were doing the private eye in period, but not in history. It occurred to me that Heller shouldn't just bump into real people, but that he should be involved in real events, that he should crack a real unsolved case. I was not thinking in terms of a series of novels, just one book, though I did contemplate the possibility of sequels, one of the reasons I made Heller a younger man in True Detective than most protagonists of private eye novels. From the first inklings of Heller, I began gathering research materials, and the case that attracted me most, that seemed like a classic underexplored Chicago subject, was the attempted assassination of FDR that wound up taking the life of Mayor Anton Cermak. My fascination for that case had been sparked by a TV show I saw as a kid. One of the pop culture touchstones that served to interest me in true crime and real detectives, or should I say real crime and true detectives, was the Robert Stack starring television series The Untouchables, based on a slightly fictionalized memoir by Eliot Ness, who was one of the real federal agents Chester Gould patterned his Dick Tracy upon. The Untouchables had done a two-part episode about the attempt on Chicago Mayor Cermak's life, and it was typically inaccurate. The series, while wonderful, played fast and loose with the facts, even as it pretended, courtesy of real newspaperman Walter Winchell's voiceover, to be a docudrama. Only the original two-part TV movie, The Scarface Gang, which aired on Desilu Playhouse and was a kind of accidental pilot film, hewed it all close to the facts of any of the cases the show explored. Years later, digging into the research, I discovered a much better story in real life, having to do with Cermak's own attempt on the life of Frank Nitti. To say more would be to spoil the story you're about to listen to, but I will say that the facts of the Cermak case and the mainstream historical accounts aren't much more accurate than the Robert Stack series, opened my eyes about the realities of Chicago crime and politics. This book could not have been written without the research assistance of George Hagenauer. I don't use the word assistant anymore, because that doesn't do George justice. He has been my great friend and collaborator on these novels, not only helping with the research, but with the interpretation of that research. The plots have always been formed out of endless phone conversations in which George and I turn over all the facts like stones, looking for the wriggling, squirmy things underneath. George now lives near Madison, Wisconsin, but he was born and raised in Chicago and lived there throughout the writing of the first 8 or 9 Heller books. He, and another valued friend and Chicago historian, Mike Gold, helped me shape the character and the world of Nate Heller. Let me give an example. When I first approached George, whom I knew through our mutual interest in collecting original comic art, we met at a comic book convention in Chicago. He was happy to help with the Chicago end of the research. Among other things, he said he could help with the sometimes complicated geography of the city and its many neighborhoods. He asked me about the story I had in mind. Well, I said, Nate Heller is a young plainclothes cop who is forced to do something corrupt. He quits the force out of moral indignation and opens his own detective agency. When he stopped laughing, George said, Max, you gotta leave all that Philip Marlowe nonsense behind if you want to write about Chicago. This is the Depression we're talking about. A young guy would try to get on the Chicago cops for the graft, to take advantage of the corruption, and you couldn't get on the force at all without a Chinaman to pull the strings. A Chinaman, he explained, was not an Asian gentleman, but someone rich enough, or anyway connected enough, to get a person a prized slot on the Chicago police force. Later, George, and I think Mike Gold accompanied us on most of the trips, would walk me around the loop, pointing out key buildings and the sites of various murders and other crimes. One time, we stopped for a Coke at a bar on Van Buren, and George discreetly pointed out a transaction taking place. The bartender was paying off the